Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now I'm going to begin with the Chinese proverb. Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll understand. And that's what we're doing here today. It's what this webcast is all about. I'm Martina Devlin. I'm a member of the Ireland's Future Management Board, and we're a civic society group set up to promote Irish unity to the benefit of all traditions on the island and advocate discussion about it. I'm going to be in conversation now with a fellow board member, Professor Colin Harvey, who's worked on an important discussion document which we're launching today. Colin is Professor of Human Rights Law at Queen's University Belfast. He's a fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Irish Studies. Now, this document is The Conversation on Ireland's Future, a Principled Framework for Change. It's online, by the way, on our website. Do take a look at it. It's quite a concise text, but it packs a punch. It aims to answer some of the key questions around the issue of referendums on Irish unity. So, Colin, what's the purpose of the document exactly, and how can it advance the discussion?
Well, Martina, I'm delighted really to be involved in this discussion. The document is really, as you know, there's a growing conversation about the future of the island of Ireland that's been very much prompted by reflections around Brexit. And I suppose really just being delighted to be involved with Ireland's future and the work that it's doing. And great to see this document, emerge into the public sphere. Really what it is it joins a line of material that's emerging to try and shape and inform a civic conversation. Really, I think two things that are very helpful about the document. First of all, setting out the principled framework for the conversation that we're having, but also trying to begin to answer some of the key questions that will shape the procedural dimensions of that. I think there's a bit of a worry that some of the technical, boring stuff around process might get neglected. So the document is really a contribution to that discussion. But ultimately, what it's trying to do, and I think what Ireland's Future is trying to do, is encourage people to engage in the conversation. So by producing relatively short, accessible documents that are publicly available, we want people to use them to shape their own conversations. Because I think what we've emphasized, and as you know, Martina, is that we really want to see people north and south on this island involve themselves in this conversation. So accessible interventions in the public debate to encourage others to participate.
Well, you've put your finger on it. The conversation is underway already. People are certainly discussing it privately. So this is bringing it out into the public sphere, is that right?
Very, very much so. I think you'll know in the last number of years, I would say Ireland's Future has led the discussion. For me personally, my involvement in Ireland's Future, the letters, the Waterfront Hall event was transformative, really.
So that was the first event, wasn't it?
I think it's been an accumulation of public interventions. For myself, Niall Murphy asked me and I said yes in terms of those letters. I spoke at the Waterfront event, really spurred on a lot of us by what was happening around Brexit and the sort of shambles that we saw unfolding around that. So
explain to people what the Waterfront event in Belfast was, in case they've been on Mars for the last few years.
I really think it was an opportunity for people to come together in a group that was much larger than I had anticipated as I was walking down to the hall that morning, to really have a think about where things were at and where things were going next. But it was also really, I think, about motivating people to engage in this discussion. And I think I learned a lot during the day, and it really has shaped everything that I've done since then, because I think what was clear that day, there's an onerous responsibility on us all to engage in this discussion. You know, we do not want to repeat the mess that we've seen unfold around Brexit. So I think there's been an overwhelming sense in the last number of years, and it's threaded through all the interventions of Ireland's future and its members as planning and preparing for where we might be going next. And really the document launched today is a small part of that bigger conversation, and there'll be much more to come in the time ahead.
So you mentioned this onerous responsibility, a sort of sense of duty, if you like. Is that what persuaded you to become involved with Ireland's future?
Yes, is the answer to that. You know, I've done a lot of work in my academic capacity around Brexit. You know, we've all seen what happened in relation to that. You know, again, Niall asked me and I said yes.
So this is Niall Murphy, the Secretary of Ireland's Future.
I said yes, have become involved in it, but because I think that, you know, Brexit raises a rather obvious point. You know, as we sit here having this conversation, one part of the island of Ireland is outside the European Union. One part of the island of Ireland is within the European Union. There's a rather obvious point to be made around that. The Good Friday Agreement gives Northern Ireland, the North, this region, a way back to the European Union. And it has really been surprising to me to see that not mentioned. And I think it would just be bizarre not to talk about it. So we have a responsibility to do the work. You know, nobody, you know, what I find slightly odd is none of us in this discussion are calling for, you know, a referendum next Wednesday or Thursday. We're responsibly arguing for the sensible management of a process of planning and preparing for change. And I've been at times but taken aback by people, in a sense, not listening to what we're actually saying. As you know, Martina, many people in this island like to engage in caricature. And I think what's been really dignified and admirable about Ireland's future and its work and the various civic initiatives is that they ultimately are the responsible people in the room calling for sensible management of a process of change.
Is it important that Ireland's future is a civic group, that it has no party political affiliation? As an entity, individuals within it may have, but as a group, there's no party political associations.
Well, I think my own view is it's important that there's civic leadership and it's important that there's political leadership. But for me, you know, if you look at where the real leadership has come on the island of Ireland in recent times, it's civil society activism. It's people, if you like, bursting out of the old narratives and creating a very different story about this island and wanting a very different future. And as with everything else, civil society, I think, will ultimately do the lead work, will lead the conversation, will do the heavy lifting. And then, you know, Martina, what you'll find is, I think what we'll all find in Ireland's future and elsewhere, in a number of years' time, people will go, they were right.
Well, you certainly hope so. Has political engagement been slow then, Colin?
I think there is political engagement. I think we've seen a range of initiatives. Obviously, some political parties are more engaged in this than others. But I think in a Northern Ireland context, there's also something to keep in mind. You know, we are a profoundly divided society. There are different views on the constitutional question. There'll be those who are very clearly for the reunification of this island, but obviously party politically, there are people who are fundamentally opposed to that. And I think mutual respect involves recognizing that, you know, that people do not need to be or should be expected to be involved in conversations that are fundamentally opposed to their basic political objectives. But what I would say to that is, just like those who are advocating for a united Ireland are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and work now, those who are arguing for the maintenance of the union with Britain also need to be doing their own work as well, you know, and making the case too. So I think the more people involved in that conversation on whatever side of the debate, the better, because I think ultimately the bottom line on this is the island of Ireland is on a trajectory towards these referendums taking place, and that wherever you stand in that argument and debate, do the preparation and planning first. You know, if you're going to turn up on somebody's doorstep if we ever do get to physically meet people again in the future and make a case, you need to be able to say something concrete about what a new Ireland's going to look like, but also for those who want to remain in the union with Britain, what that's going to look like too. So in a sense, what we're saying, and really what we're saying in the document, is we need to normalise this discussion. It's a core aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, and we just need to get on with doing the hard work of building the case on an evidence-based way.
I guess what you're saying, though, as well, is that for those who'd advocate retention of the union, the circumstances will be different there too, because of Britain and therefore Northern Ireland no longer being members of the EU. So it won't quite be the same union going forward.
I think that's absolutely right. And in many ways, Brexit is dramatically transformative of the conversation. There are many people in this region who just simply do not want to follow Boris and the Brexiteers off into whatever international wilderness and adventure they may be going on. There's also many people here who are very, very worried that post-Brexit Britain will become a very cold house indeed for human rights, for equality, for social justice. And on a pragmatic level, you know, Ireland, as a globally engaged member of the European Union, simply looks to many people like the better bet in the longer term in terms of basic issues of prosperity and well-being.
And I guess some of the progressive social issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you really, myself, very, very concerned about where Boris and the Brexiteers may be going in terms of areas that, you know, I've spent a lot of time working on in human rights and equality and social justice, the sort of socioeconomic devastation that may be inflicted on this post-conflict society as a result of Brexit is really shameful and negligent and, you know, traumatizing for people. I think myself, you know, there is simply the prospect of a better future together on this island, but obviously that's about doing the work and building the case. I think that's a sort of exciting prospect. You know, it's a great project to be involved in, but there are obviously many people are also skeptical about that. And there's hard work to be done in putting a bit of evidence and building a case around that. And, you know, there's no room for complacency on any side of this discussion at the moment. There's a lot of hard work that still needs to be done.
So what kind of evidence needs to be brought forward?
Well, I think, first of all, we're really essentially talking about a referendum. And in the context of a referendum, if you're making the case for a united Ireland, I think you have to be crystal clear to people as to what that will mean in practical terms across a range of areas that people are profoundly concerned about. What's striking to me is that although traditionally when we talk about this conversation, it tends to focus on issues of identity and culture, it's actually quite noticeable, and I've noticed it in the last number of years, how much basic social economic issues around healthcare and housing and employment and education are actually at the center of many people's concerns. So I think there's a case to be made built on evidence around what precisely a vote for Irish unity will mean in each of those areas. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think for many of us, you know, I don't use the word transformative lightly. You know, I want that to be a better prospect than what people in this region are experiencing now. You know, there's a profound sense as we think about next year and 100 years on from partition that it's been disastrous for the island. It's been an extended exercise in avoidance, really, but it's been devastating for this region, all now compounded by being forcibly removed from the European Union without consent and facing into, I think, potentially socioeconomic devastation, further socioeconomic devastation on the far end of that.
Mm-hmm. The Good Friday Agreement will frame this process. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, for me, you know, and for Ireland's future, I think ultimately it means two things. One thing is that it should be a normal discussion. There's nothing surprising in what we are saying. and there's no drama involved. Why? Because it's a core component of the Good Friday Agreement. It's there. And it sometimes worries me at a time at which people are talking about reading that document, that people do need to read it. This is at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement.
So the process of a referendum on both parts of the island, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. But also just to normalise that, to say, look, this is in the agreement. It's been legislated for in domestic law. The Constitution of Ireland now reflects that. It's underpinned by a bilateral international legal agreement. Nothing about that should be surprising. So, and the follow on from that then is the process for doing that, the process for exercising that right of self-determination is spelt out in the agreement. I suppose one of the more worrying things that I've seen in the last number of years is that although there are aspects of that that need to be fleshed out, some of the discussions are beginning to pick away at aspects of the agreement. And I think that's been a bit concerning, and we just need to keep a close eye on that in the time ahead.
Right. So a referendum on the northern part of the island, a referendum in the Republic, do they have to take place on the same day?
Well, it's a great question, Martina. One of the things that Ireland's Future and others have been trying to do is to spell out an interpretation of the agreement that we believe is as faithful as possible to the terms of the agreement itself. And you know, the view that we have is ultimately the most faithful reading of the agreement is concurrent consent and concurrent referendums, referendums that happen at the same time, rather like the concurrent referendums that happened on the 22nd of May 1998 for the Good Friday Agreement itself. And you know, if we're going to anchor all this in the agreement framework, then I think that carries enormous practical and symbolic value as well, because we do want to stress, and the document is quite clear on this, that the agreement in terms of process, but Martina, also absolutely fundamentally, in terms of values, the values that will provide people with the security that they need to make sure that, you know, what has happened on this island in the last 100 years, well, let's be honest, where we have all hurt each other tremendously, will not be repeated on this island in the next 100 years. So yes, the agreement talks about process, but I think we need to also frame the conversation in terms of the agreement's values, the values that will make sure that we're not going back to some of the things that we've seen on this island in the past.
What are those key values, Colin?
The values really of parity of esteem, mutual respect, equality of treatment, but also framed by a commitment to human rights, social justice, equality, and reconciliation. The values that really are threaded through the document. Some of those values, which, as we know, haven't been entirely realized in the 22 years since the agreement here, but which have to really frame the future. So yes, there's a lot of talk and there will be a lot of discussion about institutions, but I think, you know, we need this discussion to be values-based. You know, we don't want to share this island at the lowest common denominator level. We want to make sure that where we're going next on the island is better for people. You know, I spoke at an event the other night where it's quite, you know, clear that, you know, in terms of homelessness, in terms of child poverty, in terms of, you know, basic socioeconomic rights, if we can't make this island better, then we'll also have failed, whatever the constitutional arrangements are.
When you speak of failure, what comes to my mind is the lack of reconciliation. You know, 22 years on after the Good Friday Agreement, it's almost like it's just been parked. Is there something that can be done more proactively to advance that?
I think the proactive dimension of that is to work, we need to work the agreement in all of its parts. You know, one of the interesting things about the Brexit discussion and the language around the Irish protocol there has been the constant references to the agreement in all its parts. And what's worried me over the last few years is that people have tried to make this an either or conversation. You know, you either talk about constitutional change or you talk about working what's there now. But I think the genius really at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement is that it's not an either or conversation. We can work in the here and now for reconciliation using the institutions and relationships that are there already, and also have a conversation about constitutional change. Ultimately, Martina, you know this, we know this, Ireland's future knows this. The best way to demonstrate what the future of this island is going to look like is to prove that in the here and now, in terms of how we treat people in the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the agreement and the genius at the heart of it was that it isn't either or. We make the institutions of the agreement work. We make the institutions that reflect the relationships around these islands work. The British Irish Council, the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference, all the various bodies there, you know, that we'll need those in the future in terms of where we're going next too. So my view would be, you know, the constitutional change conversation goes alongside making the Good Friday Agreement work in all its parts.
Why does Ireland's future put such an emphasis on civic engagement?
Because, again, I can only really speak for myself and just...
Why do you put such an emphasis, Colin, on civic engagement?
Maybe just personalize it. Look, it's just been a pleasure and a privilege to be involved with you all and the group Ireland's Future over the last few years. It's had a transformational aspect and an impact on my own life in many ways, you know, as an academic too. But it's great to be involved in a civic initiative like this. Why? Because, you know, too many things on this island, too many things happen at an elite level, hidden away from the wider world, where people aren't involved, where people aren't given a chance to participate. And I think that can't happen with such a monumental change like this. And what I really admire about Ireland's Future and the work that it's done is that it's put an emphasis on citizen engagement. For example, the proposal around an all-island citizens' assembly. You know, and that, to me, that sends an absolutely clear signal. We want this to be an all-island civic conversation about change. And you mentioned it right at the start, where people participate, where people work together to design an agreed future, where it isn't negotiated in rooms with politicians and everybody else on the outside. There's been too many of those sorts of discussions on this island. So I think what's been admirable at Ireland's Future is that it is itself a civic initiative, but it has encouraged civic engagement as well. And really just for everybody listening to this evening, I would like to underline again, please join in, start your own conversation, build your own group, have the discussion wherever you're located, be involved in shaping the discussion about the future.
You mentioned a citizens' assembly or some kind of discussion forum. What exactly does Ireland's Future have in mind there?
Again, Ireland's Future is proposing, just like in recent years in Ireland, there have been a number of successful examples of areas where people might have previously thought no resolution could be found or no agreed way forward could be found, where resolution has been found.
So you're referring to things like the marriage equality referendum and the abortion reform referendum.
Repeal 8, marriage equality, you know, referring back to really an earlier point that, and it's an area that I spend a lot of time working on. My sense as equality and rights activists on this island, those engaged in civil society, are in many ways already one step ahead of us all, you know, and have shown the way for how you achieve the sorts of change that are needed on this island. And in some senses, Ireland's Future is simply learning from that. You know, like I know myself, you know, there's like, let me be clear that there's been a cost for my participation in some of this stuff. People use the language of division and that it's contentious. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that, but one way I've seen that the heat can be taken out of these issues is through constitutional conventions, citizens' assembly, where you get people around a table, they hear from experts, they listen to the evidence, and they reach conclusions. And there's clear evidence in Ireland of that being successfully done to move debates forward. And I think on this issue, it would be particularly suitable to advancing this discussion, mainly because, you know, you've raised the point about we just need people involved. We need to hear a bit more about the detail. And one way to do that is to, you know, have the assembly, have the discussion, hear from the experts, ask people what they think, and what they would like to see. And then we'll have a better idea about where we might be going next.
I think the other thing about the citizens grouping is that it has to be island-wide, doesn't it, and cross-community.
Absolutely, and key to everything that Ireland's future has stressed, which I think is important, is inclusion, a warm welcome, and participation and engagement in everything that is done. Obviously, I think we also need to be clear that, and we have to respect this, there will be clearly people on this island who do not want to engage in a conversation about designing a united Ireland. And I think we have to be respectful around that. But the invitation has to be open and welcoming to ensure that people feel welcome about being involved in the conversation. But also there has to be a clear idea about what it will mean in terms of the future. And I've mentioned the Good Friday Agreement, and I've mentioned some of the values there. Others have made the point, well, the Irish government, the Irish state could begin now. You don't have to wait to United Ireland to begin to show that welcome in the here and now. So, any concrete steps by Ireland's future or anybody else to show that there would be a very, very warm welcome for the North in any new constitutional arrangements would be fantastic. And I would encourage people to take that step now. Why wait to some future arrangement? Let's show intent in the here and now.
So, for example?
I think, what's really, really struck me is the reaction of the current government in Dublin to this conversation. I've pointed out already that this is a mainstream aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, right? So it's absolutely core to that agreement. But what do you notice, Martina? Anytime we mention this, you hear politicians in the current government refer to it as divisive, not now, contentious. I've heard people use the language of pouring petrol on, and I think that is unhelpful, right? So first of all, in framing this discussion, the current government in particular needs to show a bit of leadership in recognizing this as the core of the agreement. Secondly, I think the Irish government, in doing that, also has to make clear that there would be a warm welcome for everyone in this region in any new constitutional arrangement. So it's not good enough simply to say that this is a normal part of the agreement. And many people haven't even taken that step. But I think that there has to be open acknowledgement and encouragement to say that there would be a warm embrace on this island for the North in new constitutional arrangements. And there's all sorts of ways that you can do that in the here and now. What really struck me is that, and you'll know that this, Martina, that we're awfully siloed on this island. Whether it's the way the media reports the different parts of the island, it's the voices that are involved in our democratic institutions and who's not involved in our democratic institutions. I would like to see, for example, bearing in mind the respectful point earlier, unionist voices at the heart of the conversation in Dublin, for example. Mm-hmm. I would like to hear more Southern voices in the North. I would like for us to talk to each other and engage with each other in the here and now, and not in some abstract future. And that isn't happening. We're still living in silos, and we need to break that down in whatever tangible ways we can. I think there is a massive responsibility on the current government in Dublin to do two things: to acknowledge that this conversation is happening, and also to make absolutely clear in terms of where this might be going next, that there be a warm welcome for Northern Ireland in any new constitutional arrangements.
Well, thank you to Colin Harvey for that. Clearly, the conversation is continuing, and why would any reasonable person fear conversation? It's an opportunity to share perspectives, and hopefully there'll be more. So please check out our website, www.irelandsfuture.com. There are articles, there are interviews, there's information about those events. You heard Colin reference the Waterfront in Belfast. There was also an event in Newry and one in Dublin. We've got previous webcasts up there. And Keep an eye on social media because there'll be more of these discussions. Thank you, Colin.